Hi, and welcome to the final episode of our Wednesday seminars for the year for 2020. And today we're going to talk about hiring and onboarding, which is the fun part of HR. And we'll be talking with Penny Horton from Who's Your HR, which has the cutest little logo I've seen in a while. I really do like that. And she's in the Tulsa area, and there's some contact information. We'll have more. And then she's also added a link to the PowerPoint that she's going to be presenting today. And we're going to learn all there is to know in 45 minutes to an hour on hiring and onboarding and keep selecting the right people. So, Penny, I will hand it over to you.
Great. Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for an opportunity to share information with everyone today around what you said is the most fun part of HR, because you get to start building up your team. So I'm going to go ahead and share the PowerPoint presentation with you all. All right. So you guys should be able to see that. And I have a lot of information, as you can imagine. We could probably spend a really long time talking about all of this information. So as you mentioned, I'm going to be sharing a copy of the presentation overall so that you can go back at your convenience and take a look at it. Because we'll hit high level stuff and don't have a lot of time to dive in. But if there are questions along the way, more than happy to entertain them. I'll also carve out some time at the end in case the audience has any sort of specific questions that we'll need to go through there as well. So I'm just going to dive right in. This is a little overview of what I want to share with you all today. We're going to talk about the hiring process and the onboarding process, which involves a series of steps when you are bringing in employees into your organization. So we're going to touch on workforce planning, which is really around how you make that decision about when you're ready to bring the employees on and prepare for bringing employees on. We'll talk about the recruitment phase, so how you go out and find candidates and how you select the right employees. We will talk about the performance of those employees once you get them on the team. And then in the unfortunate event that the performance doesn't work out, I want to share just a few quick pointers on exiting someone from the organization. And then, of course, we want to touch on the payroll topic as well, because that's an important element to the retention efforts of those employees that you have found. So when you are preparing to hire your workforce, whether that's one employee or whether it's multiple employees, the planning that goes into that is essentially the same. It just needs to be a repeatable process in the event that you're going to hire multiple employees. And so the elements that I want to touch on relative to the workforce planning are really around how the timing of that for your organization, the types of employees that you might bring on, and how you classify those particular employees. So I oftentimes will get the question about, well, how do I know when it's the right time to hire an employee? And it's different, right, for every business. There are businesses that may have a more predictable way of determining that. So I think about manufacturing, for example, right? If you know that you need to build a certain number of products and it's going to take a certain number of labor hours to build those products, then you can do some headcount planning based on that. Other businesses, such as service industries, may have a more difficult time making those determinations. So in the cases where it's not clear cut and dry, I usually advise clients that, there are times when you can't get everything done by yourself and you do need to bring in someone else to help you do the work. If you find yourself doing all of the work and you're not actually investing time on growing your business, that's usually a really good indicator. Obviously, you need to be financially able to afford to bring on someone into your business. And then, you need to be ready for all of the challenges that go along when you bring employees into the business, because it does add an element of additional administrative burden. There are obviously risks that you assume when you start having employees work for you. But there's also usually some expertise or some specific skill set, right, that you need. So when you look at all of those factors, that'll help you make those determinations about whether or not it's the right time to hire. And you may have to engage, as we often do as business owners, with other experts around that. So you may have to involve your accountant or your CPA to help determine on the financial availability of that hiring decision. So it's not something you necessarily have to make alone, because it is a difficult decision for sure. Part of that workforce planning component then is also making a determination about what kind of help you need to add to your business. I come across business owners on a daily basis that want to use a contractor to help support the growth of their organization and take on those tasks, when in all actuality, they should be using a W-2 employee. So I think it's an important component when we talk about workforce planning to identify the differences, the primary differences between those two. Because if you get this wrong, you're actually adding risk to your business that you don't need to add to your business. So the difference between 1099 contractor and a W-2 employee is really much larger of a discussion than simply how you pay them. So we typically refer to a contractor as a 1099 contractor to differentiate that you're going to pay them a set amount, and at the end of the year, you're going to issue them a 1099, which is what they would use to pay their own taxes. They have responsibility as a 1099 contractor for covering all of the things that you didn't cover for them throughout the year. Typically, those are used where it is some sort of really specialized level of expertise, something that you typically would not have an employee do for you. It really is more of a vendor relationship. And typically those are done for a specified shorter period of time than what a W-2 employee would be used for. Oftentimes, business owners like the idea of a 1099 contractor because there aren't the tax implications for their own personal business. They also like it because it seems like that relationship is a little bit easier to end on a short time frame as opposed to having an employee. But I find that they often mistakenly then really are employing that person and using them in the capacity as an employee, but calling them a 1099 contractor. And that's where the risk really comes into play. So making that determination, you have to look at what that employment relationship is that you have with that individual. And there is some guidance that the Department of Labor, particularly the Wage and Hour Division, puts out that gives you some of the not hard and fast rules, but some of the significant factors that you should look at. And a lot of them have to do around the span of control with that individual, how much anonymity and say-so decision-making power does that particular individual have, whether or not that person is going to be working solely for you, or do they have other people that they perform this similar kind of work for? There's risk involved in classifying the wrong way, because obviously there are certain protections that are afforded to employees that the government is interested in making sure that those employees have. There's also the tax implications and how quickly the IRS gets tax payments when it's a W-2 employee versus a 1099 contractor. So just a lot of reasons to really explore that option and talk to someone who understands that, often someone who's an HR professional or an employment law attorney can help walk someone through that decision-making process to make sure that you set up that relationship right from the get-go and eliminate the issues of risk for your business. So that's a big one that I particularly find is very complex and confusing for business owners. The other one that I think often trips people up as you think about workforce planning, besides deciding whether it's a 1099 or a W-2, is that once you've decided that it is going to be a W-2 employee, there's concerns around exempt versus non-exempt. And a lot of people will equate that to being salary and hourly at the same time. And really, those are separate categories of employees and separate classifications. The exempt versus non-exempt is more about whether or not the employee is eligible for the criteria, or is not eligible, but falls under the criteria and the governance of the Fair Labor Standards Act and all of the requirements that we have to meet as an employer. So for example, the Fair Labor Standards Act sets out an expectation that most positions, there are some exceptions, but most positions have to be paid a minimum wage. It also clarifies when employees have to be paid overtime and what circumstances those are. That's the non-exempt part. So if you're not exempt from the overtime stuff, right, then you're getting paid overtime. The salary and hourly component is really how often and how you're paying an employee. And you can be salary exempt. You can also be salary non-exempt. And there's certain criteria when you would want to do that. If you're paying someone on a salary basis and you want to know whether or not that position should be exempt or non-exempt, there are some criteria, and that's what I've listed on the screen in my presentation to show what you need to do. At a minimum, you need to make sure that they're being paid that minimum salary threshold level, which is $684 a week. If they are getting paid at least, if they're getting paid less than that, they have to be non-exempt and you need to be paying them hourly. If they are being paid at least that minimum salary threshold level, then you really have to dive in to their duties that they have in the role to determine whether or not there's an exemption from those overtime rules. And there are what the Fair Labor Standards Act defines as bona fide exemptions, and that's for executive positions, administrative positions, professional positions, outside sales employees, and then certain computer employees. And there are fact sheets and everything else provided by the Fair Labor Standards Act that will help someone walk through and decide. They also have some online tools that you can answer some questions that they will guide you through to help make a determination whether or not someone is an exempt status. Not all employers fall under these Fair Labor Standard Acts, although many of them do. So I've included some of the eligibility guidelines for who falls under the FLSA, and it's based on not only the organization itself, but sometimes even if an organization doesn't necessarily qualify, a particular employee can qualify, and you would have to follow that. If you don't fall under those FLSA guidelines, then these things about the salary threshold level and all of that aren't a requirement. You would just then be required to follow whatever your state guidance is. However, I do know that a lot of business owners, it's just as easy to, follow these same recommendations to, I guess, create consistency so that if they do get into a situation where they become eligible under FLSA guidelines, then they don't have to worry about going and changing things later, right? So that's another one that is a complex matter that if it's not clear cut and dry for the employer, then they probably need to engage with someone to help them make those decisions to make sure that you're paying employees and classifying them properly. Misclassification has become a really big issue for the federal government, and they spend a lot of time really making sure that people are properly classified. It's all about protecting the employee and making sure that they're being treated fairly, compensated well. So that's why it's on their radar for sure. So I feel like that was a lot of information right up front on the workforce planning component alone. I think those are all the steps. I'm gonna share with the audience a handout as well, which include just a few other pointers around how you need to set things up and what you need to think about prior to hiring an employee that I didn't go into in the presentation, but it's just remembering things like workers' comp insurance, making sure that you've got an employer identification number set up, all of those kind of administrative tasks that need to happen so that you'll be ready to make your first hire.
And we will have those on our website, the SCORE website in Oklahoma City.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being willing to share those.
Quick question though,
Absolutely.
on the slide, the minimum salary.
Yes.
Yeah, I've never heard that before.
Yeah. So it was actually set much lower a couple of years ago, and they were going to actually increase it to a much higher threshold. They had a lot of discussions. And then at the last moment, that got challenged in court and it was kind of delayed. So a lot of the employers actually had went through the process of bumping them up to like an even higher minimum salary threshold. It was going to be in the 900 something a week range. And then that didn't pass. And then they came back at the beginning of this year and said that that threshold level would be higher than what it had been historically, but not quite as high as what they anticipated. So we landed somewhere in the middle at the 684. But yeah, it was a significant increase for some individuals. And so for small business owners in particular, that's a difficult thing because in many cases, they did have to take people that they were paying salary and switch them back to an hourly pay rate to be in compliance because they couldn't necessarily afford to make that big of a leap with their payroll expenses.
That's what my thought was, a mom and pop shop that hires, a high school kid to come in and help.
Yep.
Uh,
Yep. They just need to pay them hourly is what it
but
amounts
if they hire an attorney,
to.
they're going to have to be salaried.
That is correct. That is correct. Because that would be one of those, professional positions for sure. So, yep. Good.
As you said, I can see that going into, skilled positions in industry and
Yeah.
production, manufacturing that, they get a lot higher, but are they salaried or
Right.
are you restricted from being hourly over the 684?
No, you can be paid. It's always, and I always like to tell people, it's safer actually to pay people hourly from a compliance standpoint. Like if you were going to err on one side or the other, I would err and just make everyone an hourly position. Now, obviously that can create additional costs for you, right? Because if you're working someone overtime hours and you're paying them hourly, that makes them non-exempt. And then you would have to pay time and a half for anything over 40 hours. But from a compliance standpoint, it is definitely, much easier because there aren't the requirements. There aren't any restrictions. You could pay someone any dollar amount that you wanted to if they were being paid hourly. As long as you're meeting the minimum wage requirement that you have to, then the sky's the limit on what you want to pay them there. So it's a good topic for discussion for sure. If you're in that situation, particularly if you have people on the cusp, right? Where they're almost at that level, or are they not at that level? That's a really great time to have that discussion. So, yeah. Good questions. Anything else before we jump on to the next section in our hiring and onboarding, which is recruitment? No? Good. All right, we'll jump on in if there is. So from a recruitment process, that is really about how you identify the talent that you want to bring into your organization and what the actual logistics and the process and the steps are that you need to follow to do that. So we'll start off and we'll talk about defining the job requirements and then move into how you source your candidates, how you make that final selection, which is your interview process. And then, of course, the really fun part, which I always enjoy, which is making a job offer, right? Changing someone's life, giving them good news, and getting someone, secured to come on the team. So under the job requirements, one of the things that we need to do as a business owner is really think about absolutely what is necessary in order for this person to achieve success. So really, what would good look like from our perspective if we're going to, go out on this limb, hire someone to come in and join the organization? We should know what they're going to be doing and what it takes in order for them to be skilled to do that. I always recommend people think about that from an absolute bare minimum standpoint. A lot of people have a particular or personal bias around something that they want to see somebody have. But I always challenge them to think about, is that an absolute non-negotiable, like we know they're not going to be successful if they don't have that? Or is it a nice to have, right? So a plus, but not a must. And you need to think in those terms because that's going to impact your selection process as you start getting resumes and you start hearing from candidates who are interested in your position. Because if you set out a requirement that you've determined is an absolute must, and then you find a candidate that you like that doesn't meet that absolute must criteria, right? But you want to move forward with hiring them, then you've exposed yourself to a situation where all of the other candidates that you potentially looked at that had that lower, skill set or a lower level of education or didn't quite have the exact number of years experience, you've opened it up to where they could say, why the heck didn't you hire me, right? If you made an exception to this rule. So it's nice to have a plan in advance. Now, you can always go back, I guess, and decide that I'm not going to hire someone maybe at a senior level, and I'm really going to make it an entry level position. But that kind of restarts the clock, right? And you've got to kind of start your process. Now, I say all of that to say that obviously, depending on the size of your organization, there are a variety of different hiring and employment laws that you have to meet. And obviously, the more employees that you have in your organization, the more interested in your compliance is at the federal level. If you don't have, 100 employees or more, or 50 employees or more, right? If you're just hiring like your first employee, you're probably not on the radar from a federal hiring standpoint because there are kind of toll gates. So 1 to 14 employees, there's a certain set of federal laws that you have to meet. Once you hit 15, you add on a couple more. You hit 20, there's a couple more. You hit 25, there's a couple more. Then you hit 50, there's some. 100, there's some more. And if you're a government contractor or subcontractor, there's a whole slew of things. So it's important to understand those employment laws and which ones are impacting your hiring decisions. So I'll just talk in general terms and we'll just say on the strictest of rules, right? You want to be really definitive around, is it absolutely necessary from an education standpoint to have a college degree, right? Or is it someone really could actually have just a trade school degree? Or maybe they just need to have graduated high school, right? To really be able to do that job. So I always like to think about it in terms of if I had to defend it to someone else, right? what would it about their job say that this is an absolute must have? It gets a little bit easier on the technical side of things, like if there's specific programs or softwares that they have to work on, right? Or if they are going to be a leader, you're probably going to want to see that they had experience. So just think in terms of the absolute must or just a nice to have. And then in addition to those requirements, you also need to outline what, not everything, because we can't possibly do that, but what your day-to-day responsibilities are going to be for the role. So I usually say like 75% of their time, if they're going to be doing these tasks on a regular basis, let's kind of outline what those tasks would be. Those other things that they'll do occasionally, not very often, that really make up like this other 25%, we can lump that into everyone's favorite category of other job duties as assigned, right? So think in terms of big bucket, what are they going to do? You need to know that because that's going to help drive how you select and how you source your candidates. So you're going to take those job requirements that you have, and that's going to build out your job description, right? Which is really what is supposed to set the stage to let candidates know that in this particular role, this is what I'm going to do, and this is what I need to know. That's separate from a job posting. A job posting is once you have those requirements defined, then how do you market that post, how do you market that opening to someone else? A lot of people will take the job posting, don't get me, or the job description and use that as their job posting. That's perfectly fine, but I can tell you that nobody reads your big long job description if that's what you're posting out there, right? Because they're not usually exciting to read. They're lengthy. Sometimes they have a lot of terminology in there that doesn't really seem to get to what you want. A job posting should be more of what I call like a marketing approach, but you'll build those off of there. And then you're going to need to decide like, where do you post it? How are you going to collect those resumes? Are you going to ask somebody to help find you the candidate, right? You can always pay someone to go out there, a staffing firm or a recruiter, to do that for you. Otherwise, you may be, you may not be in that position, and you may just be getting all of these resumes via email, which is absolutely fine. You just need to make sure that you're detailed and organized enough to know and keep record of those resumes that are coming in for that particular job, and then what you did with that candidate in the process, right? Did you decline them out of the process because they didn't meet your qualifications? Did you interview them, but they did poorly on the interview? Did you actually end up hiring them? So you can imagine, particularly for lower, like entry level jobs, you may get a ton of resumes, right? That you would have to do, that you might have to, go through and keep track of. So it can be a little bit cumbersome. So just know before you kind of get that job out there and posted, what you'll, what your tracking mechanisms or whatever are going to be. And then you'll weed out, as you start obtaining those resumes and things, you're going to want to weed out people, right? Ultimately, you want to select the most qualified and the best fit for your organization. Depending on how many resumes you get, right, will determine maybe how much work it takes to narrow down that particular list of candidates to get to a smaller list, right? Like if you only have 5 people that have submitted resumes, well, it's pretty easy to go through those 5 resumes, narrow it down to maybe the top 2, and then, interview those 2 and decide how you, who you move forward with. And maybe it's neither and you start back at square one. I don't know. If you get 100 resumes, that's a different scenario, right? So you've got to set up some parameters on how you kind of weed those out. And so oftentimes if you do something like post on Indeed as a particular job board, or Facebook, you can build in things like pre-qualifying questions, or, use some of the tools that are built in there to help you set that out. There are definitely, with that job posting, when you do that, you're going to have to make a decision about whether or not you publish your compensation range. And you're going to have to, you have to decide what that is, that range is financially, what you can afford, right? But then you're also going to need to know what people would find attractive in a pay range. Of course, the higher is the better, but we can't always do that. But what does the market bear? And so if you're a small business owner and your resources are limited, then you're probably going to have to rely on just some Google searches, internet searches, to get a good idea, right? Oftentimes you can look at other people in your area that are in a similar industry hiring for those same kind of positions. If you do have a contact at a staffing agency, or you're doing working with a recruiter, they can give you insight into what the market bears. Our local HR organizations. So I know there's one in the Tulsa area called Tulsa Area Human Resources Association. There is one in the Oklahoma City area as well. OKCHR, they would have access also to resources that could help you define what a compensation range would be in those areas. You can also just go to things like salary.com or places like that. The only caveat I would say is that some of those internet-based sources are going to be what people self-report. And so you may need to take it with a grain of salt because that may or may not be actually, good, valid information because it is self-reporting. So I think through a little bit of research, you can kind of determine. I know, though, as small business owners, oftentimes that's driven by budget constraints. And so you can also work with your accountant or, CPA firm or something, and they can help you do an analysis of what you could afford. That would be the other deciding factor on how you determine that comp. But I've found that the more transparent you can be and publish that, that will also help drive the interest in your positions, right? And if it is a lower position than what someone's willing to work for, they won't even go through likely and apply. So it saves you a little bit of time, on the front end. A lot of people like to keep that close to the vest, though, and you don't have to publish it. That's totally your call about where you disclose what your range is. It just may affect, some of the administrative burden or some of the fallout in your candidate selection
Good
list.
question before we leave this slide.
Yeah.
When you're, as an employer, you get 25, 30 resumes. When you're requesting things like work examples or references, is it a permitted, number one, and maybe advisable to make that a step two? Go ahead and get the base information and then ask for more later.
I do. I like to use that as a way to differentiate between the candidates that I feel are a good match on paper. So that is definitely helpful. Oftentimes you'll get, particularly if you're posting out on like a public job board of some sort, you'll oftentimes get a lot of people that don't even meet the minimum qualifications for your position, unless your qualifications are really super low. Like if it's really an entry level job where you don't need any experience and maybe you just need like minimal education and you need, I don't know, just like good mechanical ability or something, right? So many people will apply to those. So you can use that, right? Rather than making and frustrating a lot of candidates of making your initial application process burdensome, you could reserve that for a second step, right? And help you further differentiate that. So that's a great point to keep narrowing it down. I've also used it at the end of the process, right? When I've identified 2 candidates that I really like, then I'll even use it later and say, okay, provide me a couple of work samples, right? From what you've got, or come in and do, I don't know if it's a filing job, for example, come in and file. We'll do like a little timed filing test, right? And whoever scores the best, could end up being the successful candidate in that regard. Yeah, good question. When you're at the point, right, you've got a shorter list, right? Somehow you've narrowed that list down. you should not have to interview a zillion people. If you're having to interview a zillion people, we probably should go back and look at your initial application and kind of pre-screening process, because you want to get to a point where you're only doing real interviews with a handful of candidates, because this is the more labor intensive part. So I recommend creating a standard interview process and knowing before you go into that hiring process that we're going to have this, we'll do one phone pre-screen and we'll do one in-person interview, or we'll do, two of those and it'll be with the team or whatever it looks like. So there's some tips on the standard interview process. I don't have time to go into a lot of all of these. My best advice, though, is to learn what behavior-based interviewing is. You can do a search on the internet. The idea is that past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. So when you're designing your interview questions, which you want to ask the candidates all the same interview questions so that you can compare side-by-side answers of your candidates, you want them to actually give you examples of when they've done something similar to what you need them to do in your role. Because again, if they've done it, if they've handled that situation like that before in the past, they will likely handle it again that way in the future. And so that's going to give you the best insight into what that person might be as they actually come on as an employee. And you're going to want to keep notes. Remember, anything that you write down can be reviewed later by legal counsel at some point, right? So just make sure that when you're taking your notes, you're not writing anything that would, somehow be putting you or your company at risk. But making the entire interview process, the questions that you're asking and the notes that you're taking, very much focused on the job and the job duties and the responsibilities of being an employee, and stay away from the personal stuff as much as possible. That's where we get in trouble.
Where do things like time availability, working shift work and things like that, distance, um, not necessarily personal, but can you get to the job on time or you're going to be out
Yeah.
with, you've got 11 kids at home and you're the sole provider of care,
Yep. Yep. Yeah. All very job related though, right? Because I'm certain the position that you would be interviewing for has a set schedule, right? So if you say, yep, I'm going to interview you to be a receptionist at our facility. We need front desk coverage from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. Do you have any reason why you couldn't work those expected hours and be here when we need you, which is 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Right? That's how you ask that question.
it's the way you ask it, not necessarily what you ask.
Yep, that's exactly right. Now, they may volunteer personal information, which is perfectly fine. Again, I always revert it back though to this is an expectation or a requirement of the job. And so, thanks for sharing with me that you have 11 children, right? I just want to make sure that, you're going to be able to meet this schedule. Do you think that that's going to be accomplishable? They're going to say yes, of course, because they probably want the job, right? And then you got to hold them to that expectation relative to that, right? So you don't need to ask them if they, how good's their car, right? Again, here's the days that you would need to be at work, or this is where you're traveling to as part of this job, right? Will you have the ability to get where you need to go at these particular scheduled times? So always just refer it back to the job and you'll be perfectly fine. Perfectly fine. The fun part is once you get down, right, and decide who you want to hire, then you've got to put together that job offer. And I recommend, no matter how entry level the position is, so even if it's a minimum wage job, I would put that offer letter in writing, because it avoids miscommunicate. Like, I don't know how many conversations I've had with people, with employees that say, oh, I thought the job was paying $11.50 an hour. And we're like, no, it was not 11.50 an hour. It was 9.50 an hour or whatever, right? Well, that's a really big difference when you're talking wages. So I always say put it in writing and make sure that the individual knows what your offer is contingent upon, right? Like, I'm going to extend you this offer. Here's the details of it. But because we do a background investigation, you need to know that if for some reason you don't clear the background investigation, then we would rescind our job offer. So all other things go well, we'll go ahead and give you this job. And give them as much details as you can around it. What does the first day look like? What documents do they need to bring with them? What do they need to be prepared for? Employee engagement is at its highest when the employee first starts their job. And so the number one thing employees want to know is that you're excited and that you're prepared for them to be there, right? So you may not have the world's best onboarding process, right? Your training may still be in development. Your first week in the office may be chaos and it may not go as planned. But if they have an idea, right, that you were prepared and these are the things that you've put in place, that will engage them. If, however, they show up, right, and they're like, and whoever in the office, whether it's you or someone else, is like, oh, I didn't know you were going to be here today, right? They're scrambling around to do whatever, then you're missing out on engagement right away. So that usually requires some logistics and some coordination to make sure that they have the things that they need to at least feel welcomed into the group. So you've got a difference, I like to always point out that there's really a difference between an orientation and onboarding. Orientation is that welcome to the company. Here's like all the stuff we have to do to get you set up as a new employee and, really welcome you to the team. And we're going to, give you all of those mandatory kind of HR things, right? Around policies and procedures. And we'll fill out all of the necessary paperwork. And if there's benefits, we'll get you enrolled. We're going to get you computer logins, or we're going to show you where your workstation is. That's all the orientation to the company. That's not onboarding. Onboarding is that ongoing training of how does that employee actually learn what their job is and how they need to be successful. Orientations and onboardings can last different lengths of time. You may have a one-day orientation. You might have a week-long orientation. You can design it however you want. Onboarding, depending on the level of job and the complexity, may be a couple of hours, right? It could be weeks. It could be months. It all depends on the complexity of the job and, of course, your process. The idea, though, is that you know what that looks like in advance and have some plan so that employees can be successful throughout that process. You want to give them the tools, the equipment, the knowledge, the know-how to succeed in your organization so that you can make them an effective employee and create this win-win environment. That, between the job description, that onboarding process, and setting those expectations, gives you an opportunity to manage performance. And I know we're not necessarily talking a lot about managing performance today, but I would be remiss if we didn't talk about it at least a little bit. When you write out that job description and identify what those job requirements are, and you're thinking about what it takes to be successful, you should take the time to make sure that that's articulated well, right? We know on the back end, once we do hire you, that if we want success to look like this, this is how we're going to measure it, right? So if you're a receptionist, you're going to have certain expectations for that receptionist, right? Promptly answering the phone, being a friendly greeting, giving a friendly greeting to visitors into the office. Maybe there's some clerical tasks that they have to do. Maybe they're also going to handle mail distribution for your organization. Whatever it is, you want to establish what those metrics are and make sure that that person knows. 9 times out of 10, the person that you've hired just wants to be successful. They just want to know, what do I need to do to make sure I'm being successful? So you communicate that up front through a goal setting process. And it doesn't have to be super complex. It can be simplified, right? They just need to know what are the parameters. That way, You can reward people when they meet those expectations. And if they don't meet those expectations, then you can address the gaps. Money is not the only motivator for everything. So understanding what is motivating your employees, do they like challenging work? Are they motivated when they're busy all the time? Do they like leading a special project, right? Do they like to have opportunities where they can grow their skill set? Do they like to do presentations? Maybe they need flexible work arrangements because their kids are home every other week and they need to be there for them, right? There's other things you can do besides monetary recognition to motivate and reward behavior if you just take the time to figure out what people like. Now, some people are just simply motivated by money, and that's easy. Other things, you might have to do a little bit of research. Some people don't like public accolades. Some people do, right? You just have to know the individual. That's going to work to your advantage. Not only when you're, recognizing and rewarding, but then also how you address some of the gaps that you might have. So can't talk about managing performance and overlook the fact that some people just won't live up to expectations. And you've got to, I always like to coach people that you look at things in a way, is it skill where there's a gap, or is it will? And I see those as two very different corrective action processes or remediation processes to address. Skill, we can hopefully get somebody the right training or the right tools or the right equipment, right? If we figure out that someone's not greeting customers in a friendly way, maybe if it's skill related, it's because they don't understand what your definition of good customer service is, right? And that needs to be clarified. I always want you to say, please and thank you, or, a prompt response within, 2 hours of leaving a voice message is the kind of customer service, right, that our organization wants to do. So you give them the skills that they need to do that, right? Oh, you don't know how to, you can't create this effective PowerPoint presentation to me because you don't know how to use PowerPoint. Let's get you some training on that particular PowerPoint. Those are skill gaps, right? You can come up with remediation plans for those. That's different than what I call a will gap. So that's where they have the technical skills, the know-how, the ability to do it, and they're just not doing it. It could be because they don't enjoy doing it. It could be because they're not comfortable doing it. It could be because they don't want to. They're not engaged in your organization anymore. Maybe they just don't agree with it. Those are a little bit different because it's typically behavior-based kind of things, right? And so that's when maybe coaching or mentoring or even something more drastic, such as a corrective action and discipline, comes into play, right? And you've got to really outline what your expectations are. HR always said, if you don't document it, it didn't happen. So you've got to be good at making sure that you're keeping notes about conversations that you've had, giving feedback to people in writing so that they have a chance to respond. And there's a lot of ways that you can document poor performance. And I've listed out several of those, obviously, on the website that you would want to do some research and, dive into a little bit more before you just go do it. But plenty of resources out there to help you document poor performance. And you need that because if you do get to the unfortunate termination point where you're going to help someone be more successful in another organization and another role outside of your company, then you need to know how to terminate properly. I don't want to dive into that because we're really talking about hiring and onboarding, but there is obviously a time frame where someone's going to leave the organization. It could be on their own free will, right? They may resign, they may retire. If you have had a great employee that lives out their career, that's awesome. There's still a termination process that goes along with that. Termination it's always seemed like it has a negative connotation, but it really just means ending that employment relationship, right? It could be a termination that is negative, like a firing for cause because they couldn't meet your performance expectations or they violated a policy. So I've put out some steps that you'll want to walk through and make sure that you're prepared for. Again, it's a process like anything else. So outline what that should look like in advance. Don't do it by the seat of your pants and just like, sporadically one day decide that you're going to fire someone. That's where we usually get into trouble. Make a checklist, create a process, follow that process, trust the process, and use that process, and you'll do a lot better on mitigating the risk in your organization when you do that. And if it's risky, always get some sort of HR, right, or legal advice for sure. Here's some pointers on what not to do when you fire, which I think are just as important. My biggest one is don't apologize during that termination meeting. A lot of employers will say, "Oh, I'm so sorry that I have to do this." That doesn't come across sincere because obviously, while it's not a comfortable situation, that makes the situation about you, and it's not about you, right? This is a time when we need to be empathetic and caring to an individual, even though we're delivering bad news. And doing something like saying, "Oh, this is so hard for me," doesn't sit well with someone because you're not the one getting fired, right? They are. They're the ones, now you're impacting their life negatively. So don't, take your guilt, right? Project it on them. Try to be empathetic, but, obviously to the point, there's some reasons that led to that termination, and address it respectfully. And then just some good tips and tricks there on how if you have to do that unfortunate conversation, what that looks like. I think the last topic that I want to touch really quickly on today is around payroll. The vast majority of us work to support our livelihood, right? Most of us aren't working because it's just something that we enjoy doing. I all hope we get to that point someday, but most of us aren't there yet. So the payroll process is really important, one, for employee retention, but there are a lot of compliance issues around payroll processing. And so you need to make sure that you get that set up right. So I've provided for you this kind of step-by-step guide of what you need to do. The first thing is really deciding what payroll system and how you're going to do that. Are you going to do the payroll yourself, or are you going to hire that, to be outsourced by someone? Are you going to use an online system? There are so many options for business owners to do that. It really comes down to one, what you can afford, and then two, making sure that you feel comfortable and can meet the expectation about how soon you pay someone. Particularly if you have hourly employees, the longest that you can go without paying them is 2 weeks, right? Like they have to be paid every other week in order to be compliant. So that means that you are utilizing or doing this administrative work, executing it on a pretty regular basis, right? So you need to be able to make sure you come up with the time and the resources to be able to do that. But just like everything else, I keep telling you, the more that you can set things up in advance, the better your outcomes will be. So if you can think about what your strategy is, like when will the pay dates be? When are the pay periods going to run? Like when do you start keeping time and stop keeping time for that week? And then when does that paycheck happen, right? Because most of us are behind. Like we'll track hours for the previous week and then pay it out the next week. Well, you just need to define all that because you can't go through and keep changing pay dates all the time, right? Are there, paid time off that you're going to offer? Are you going to pay for holidays? Do those factor into overtime pay? How are you going to pay? Are you going to, require that the employees do direct deposit? Or are you going to manually hand write out checks? Or are you going to pay them with a preloaded card that you put the money on? What kind of time frame is it? If you're writing out checks and giving it to them, like when are you going to distribute those? Are they going to be like they come in the office and pick them up, or are they going to get mailed? All of those little details, right? Having that ironed out in advance will make it go much quicker. And of course, there is audit records, and you have to do a fair amount of record keeping when you're tracking payroll. So whether you choose to do it on your own through like an online, payroll provider, or if you engage with someone, just make sure that you understand all of those compliance reasons, the kinds of ins and outs, so that again, you're protected. because all of that is really auditable when it comes down to it. And that is it. That's what I've got. I think we have just a few minutes left in our time together. This is my team. And so we obviously can answer any questions that you all have more. We love sharing information with business owners for sure. So we wanted to include our contact information. But if you have additional questions that we didn't get to, happy to entertain those in our last couple of minutes.
I have one real quick one on your offering the job, but requiring background checks and like a drug screening.
Yes.
You do that after the offer contingent upon passing?
Yes.
Or
yes.
you wouldn't do that before the offer?
Correct. Because most of the hiring points like that can create a perception of discrimination if you did it prior to actually extending the job offer, right? So what you want to do is say, I've chosen you. You are the best candidate for this. You know, there is an additional step in the process, right? Otherwise, you would potentially get to the situation where people are saying, well, the only reason you didn't hire me was because this item that was on my background check, right? And you ended up hiring someone else. And I think this was a form of discrimination because you know that there's these issues with the, you know, criminal records, all these things, right? It just puts too much risk up. So if you can say, you know what? We didn't even count your background as part of our hiring process, or we didn't count that pre-employment drug screen as part of our hiring process. Like, we chose you and then we asked you to go do it. Then you're afforded more protection as an employer. Yep. Great question.
We had one potential employer who required a drug screen before application.
That is interesting.
Didn't get a lot of applicants.
Correct. Because then people are thinking, well, I'm doing it as part of this application process. I don't even know if you're interested in me. We haven't had a conversation yet. I don't know if it's a good match for you, right? It's not some people, it used to be really big to put your social security number, ask for that on an application. And of course, people, as they should have been, very skeptical about providing that, right? Because you can obviously access a lot of information about someone with a social security number. And so it just makes people uncomfortable. So reserve that kind of stuff for later, right? You will need the social security number to do a background check, but you don't need that on all your candidates. You need that on the candidate, right, that you want to hire. Yep. Great. Any other questions?